And as Rame's son Ramon made clear, how are we here? Might be a little cliche to say, why are we here?
Is it? It's large, okay.
And the reality is that there's these constructions that we keep flitting about and that keep sort of passing around our bodies, but somehow never seem to really go into our bodies. If I'm thinking about kind of what he said, the constructions of masculinity, of gender, of identity, etc. And I guess my answer slash thinking on this is that really we're in a moment where we can really start to question these things quite seriously. It's no longer looking from the side or just watching videos or reading books. I think we're really in a new region of the world where we really should begin to embody these questions and not just be scared of approaching them. So I guess to begin with, I guess maybe I should tell you who the hell I am. My name is James Oscar. As they said, I'm an anthropologist and an art historian. And the way I got here, other than as Ramon made clear, than beyond my mother and father, is that my parents are from Trinidad, and I was not born there, but I was very impregnated by one of the most important events that actually holds the whole year of Trinidad, which is the carnival. The carnival is a literal turning on its head of everything that Ramon said we need to do. It turns on its head mother, father, master, slave, colonizer, colonized. Everything is inverse. In fact, the beginning of carnival in the Caribbean was a day for the slaves to dress like the masters and to imitate them, to inverse the domination that was going on. And as you can imagine, as a young child spending a little bit of time in Trinidad, I was just completely moved by the idea of the carnivalesque. And also, I guess, what I also learned is I learned to look in a different way. And that's what I really want to start with. My whole thing today is really about how we look at things, how we frame things, how things are framed for us, how can we look together? How can we stop looking to? How can we look into something? So I'll begin right now, and the title of and I do ask you for patience in this presentation. It's going to be a bit of time, probably 60 minutes. I am taking advantage because Rame Quen has been beyond generous with me. I guess the life of an exile is that you have to go to another place to be heard. And I mean, I might get a little bit emotional now because my friends are here, and Rame told me to come home before I came here. And he made me very much at home this week. So thank you, Rame, for inviting me, and thank you for giving me space, and I'm going to take all the space I need to talk today. So let's begin with looking. In the first instance is the one-way looking to and then looking away. There's looks that looks away, so there's a look where you look away, and that's a kind of a one-way look. It's a one-way look from one thing to another. There's no engagement in that looking. There's no exchange in that looking. It seems to me like it's a rapturous denial of seeing. And that's really what I'm trying to speak about today. How, again, do we see? How do we move away from being a voyeur? How do we move away from the look? There's the look, and then there's the looking away. And this seems to be a way of framing knowledge. When you don't engage with the object, when you just look at it and you don't allow the object to look back at you, that is a looking to and a looking away. And I see that looking away as a denial. I see it as a denial of seeing. And when I talk about seeing, I'm thinking of Rimbaud and how he talks about le dérangement des sens. How do I derange my senses, whether it's through alcohol, drugs, insanity, so that I can actually look away, look in and not look away. And that looking in is what I'm trying to speak to today. This looking away could be qualified as a sort of an adjacent looking. It's a parallel looking. It's a looking almost there with the person, but not with the person or with the thing. It's a looking away. It's a denial of any kind of shared space. Looking to, without the looking back, as a mere window of contemporary life. And this looking to and looking away is a dissemination of ideological projects. Today I'm using the example of the construction of Canada, but it could be any country, it could be anything which denies a looking with and a looking together. And again, I'll say, please have patience. This is a bit of a poetic intro, which I came up with and I definitely wanted to read. So I think in the looking away, and moreover in creating images, there's a certain apparatus. And when you see the word dispositivos, what it means is apparatus. And what does this apparatus mean? Let's go down. What is a dispositivo? What is this thing that is framing our looking? I don't know if we can read that up there, but I can read it out. So this is from a philosopher named Giorgio Agamben. He talks about apparatus. That is the translation of dispositivo. So I would just explain it without even reading this in a way. The apparatus of contemporary society is at every place we walk, everything we breathe, everything we inhale. Signing on to Instagram, going into the store and speaking to somebody. It's a series of continual engagements throughout our days and nights that form our imaginaries. He says, I shall call an apparatus literally anything that is in some way has the capacity to capture, orient, determine, intercept, model, control, or secure the gestures, behaviors, opinions, or discourses of living things. And I will not just stay in this mode of negativity in this lecture, because there are answers, but I really need us to understand what we're dealing with and what this beast is. It's not only therefore prisons, madhouses, the panopticons, schools, confession, churches, factories, disciplines, judicial messers, and so forth, but it's also pen, writing, literature, philosophy, agriculture, cigarettes, navigation, computers, cellular telephones. We are always being framed every day of our life, and we also are every day of our life seeking a way out of that framing, the refuge from it. And in that framing, in that apparatus, we are denying the coming of a community. In the looking away and in the one-way looking, advertising, Instagram, we crush the very notion of community as an actual community. And here today in my talk, my interest is in how imaginaries themselves can allow us to have all sorts of looking. We're not condemned to this. We are looking, the looking that often becomes longings to look, that at times remain at the outside view, looking that denies the motion of a mutual looking. In the second sense of looking, there's a hopeful, mutual looking with. You look at me, I look at you. In both senses, we hope for a kind of relation of looking, a kind of two-way street that allows an easy back and forth, an infinite arrow of time, where we begin to sense a notion of mutual looking and of skilled visions. And in the third instance, which is where we really want to be, we think to a looking with. Being a kind of a communal form of seeing, a seeing together, the looking together of a coming community, not with images that are repositories of what they are told to be, but rather open images, images we can dive into, images we can swim in, images we can talk to, images that speak to us, open modes of looking and visioning. A mutual looking that every stage allows the mutability of life, thinking, and circumstance. The looking together of a coming community, so to speak, a communal form of being with, as we look with, a hopeful kind of a complete stream of synchronicity, a community of lovers, as one philosopher calls it, a kind of communitas, which means those moments when you're in a community where you feel the collective energy. That's the kind of looking I'm dreaming of. Not in the sense of the triumph of the will and the Third Reich, but rather in the sense of a community, a community-led effort to look and to move outside of ideology and to again create new cosmologies from and in looking. The possibility of an intense looking together. A looking with that shared space that only lovers share. The looking with or looking together, sharing the parcel of an enlightenment that can never be crossed alone. It is a shared riding together, a looking together. It is a looking in, and I would name this a skilled vision. So I just want to stop there for a minute, because I don't want to just speak to you guys. So essentially, I am a Canadian, whatever that means, and we have some Canadians in the audience. And I'm part of a very, very interesting company or corporation or country, whatever you want to call it. It's an entity that's been able to create a looking to, a looking at, more than any other product, I think, in the history of the world. And you're going to see what I'm talking about in a minute. The Canadian imaginary continues to be defined in a way of Canada, the place to go, this virginal territory, this snowy backdrop. And it really takes away from the social complexity that actually lives there, that is actually there. And that's why I'm talking about looking today. And I'm using the example of Canada and actually how art and advertising has been deployed to create this image, which is definitely not a looking together, a looking with. So let's move on. So here we are. This is a little trigger for Rame. Rame might have to leave here because I'm really trying to trigger him. So here is the Pueblo Magicos. That's what's on the screen, right? Right, Rame? Is it there? Okay. And I put it next to the Canadian sign. And this comes out of a dialogue that Rame and I have just begun. And this is really the looking to, the looking at. When you go to the Pueblo Magicos in Mexico, there are those colorful letters that welcome you, welcoming you in, but really not welcoming you to really enter into the real reality of that place. And I put right next to it the Canadian flag. And these are all ways of framing. These are all dispositivos. Looking. Dispositivos are guided by framed visions. A skilled vision would be something that incorporates a looking with, a looking together. The looking together of a community. Not a nation that builds a false pretense of what it is. Hegemonic ways are a one-way looking to frames. Lookings to are rapturous denials of seeing. We've already gone through this. So what is a looking with? Looking with compels communitas. How do we look together? What is skilled vision? So when I talk about skilled vision, I'm taking this idea from an anthropologist who, and my work kind of is, I'm a visual anthropologist. So this is kind of where my work is. So she says, in defining the idea of skilled vision, a large part of ethnographic research, of theoretical reflections, and of common sense assumptions about vision presumes that those who see are individual spectators. That's impossible. We're part of an apparatus. Or that we're individual social actors who impose certain social representations on experience. But we know, as I've just explained, that we're part of an apparatus. But a skilled vision approach considers vision as a social activity. It's not just a voyeuristic moment of opening your webpage. It is a proactive engagement with the world. That is skilled vision. So here we come to Canada. So, funny fact, the official name of Canada is not Canada. I know there's some Canadians there, I hope they don't correct me, but I checked the Constitution many times. The official name of Canada today is the Dominion of Canada. My British friends in the audience don't believe this. They can't believe this. And the reason it's called the Dominion of Canada and not the Kingdom of Canada, which is actually what the real name of Canada is today, is because they did not want to scare the Americans, who definitely had already got rid of the British. So, under the Constitution of 1982, still today, the official name of Canada is the Dominion of Canada. A dominion, and let's make sure we understand what this means. A dominion is a place ruled over by a king or queen. The term dominion was chosen to indicate Canada's status as a self-governing polity of the British Empire. So, let's keep something in mind. And I'm not trying to knock a country, I'm just trying to speak about the reality of how we develop nations. I still have the Queen on my dollar. The Mexicans do not have the King of Spain on their money. And that's pretty much all you need to know. So let's move on to how we have made this image of Canada. And this is really, really something that I really want to go through. Is that if I am the person who's doing the thing here, can I go off this and go on the web now? Because I want to show some images. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to do that a few times because I didn't want to load, I wanted to literally just go into Google Images. But for now, while we're setting that up, so we can wait, if you could just stay here while I set this up. So, oh, and I forgot I actually have notes here. So, the thing about Canada is, it's been defined as this notion of a great white north. What's interesting about this is that this notion of the great white north and of the north and northernness is something that actually goes back to the Romans and to empires. Notions of northernness have always been a way of framing other people, of framing other places. And the first way we've done this is with the advertising for the Canadian Pacific Railway. According to one person, this is the only company that would come remotely close to, in terms of producing iconic commercial design like Coca-Cola. So can we try and get the images, if I could switch now? And I guess while we're waiting for him. So basically, what's important to know is that the Canadian Pacific Railway started in 1885. And of course, the settlers came to Canada and they needed to develop, quote unquote, the land there. And they built the railway. So in building the railway, they needed people to use the railway, they needed to come to Canada, people to come to Canada and settle it. So they created this ad campaign, and one of the largest ad campaigns in history, that of the Canadian Pacific Railway. And what's interesting is, this is where we really begin to get the image of the Great White North. And of this innocent, pure, virginal territory. It is the best example of a dispositivo I've seen in a long time. Let me see what he's saying. Whoops. Okay. Oh, no, I have the internet. I just need to turn that off and go to the...
You can just switch from your...
So we're going to start with the images of the Canadian Pacific Railway, which is somewhere. Okay, so you guys can see that, right? And I need to, you said maximize again, right? So you guys are seeing everything? Okay, so this is the advertising campaigns that were created. One of the most interesting ones is, let's see here, there's just so many there. I wonder how much you guys are seeing it. Oh, you're seeing it pretty well, actually. Yeah, I was just going to open maybe a few of them. So, as you can see, it's the construction of Canada as this, as you can see, as this great white territory. And as I'm going to get to, and the title of my lecture is called Terra Nullius, right? This idea of an empty space, and I might as well just explain this now. Terra Nullius is a concept from the Romans. What the Romans essentially said is, we can take any land that's empty. Terra Nullius, empty land. That also means that they could also take any land where there were barbarians on it, because that was also considered terra nullius. So to really clarify, to make this more concrete, the history of Canada and of the land dispossession of indigenous peoples actually rests on this concept from the Romans, such that even today in court cases where there is indigenous people trying to get their land back, they still invoke this notion of terra nullius. Basically, that the indigenous people there are not proper custodians of the land. And I swear to God, this still is really what is going on. So, the literal embodiment of terra nullius comes with an advertising campaign, as you can see there, right? Open a few of them. It's always this notion of an empty land where there's nobody there. I don't know how this is working. Okay, there we are. So I don't know how much I'm going to get into this with the visual. I'll try and open a few. And also, keep in mind, when you have to have this empty land, you need people to protect it, right? So this is a great image. I'm not going to make it bigger because I think it's too complicated. Oh, you can see it. So this is really a good example of the empty land with the RCMP. This is the police that were created actually to make sure that the indigenous people behaved. Contrary to how fun they look with the red uniform and everything, that's why they were created. They were created to protect that land. And of course you see the misogyny. You can't have these ads without a little bit of misogyny there, right? So he is protecting the woman from whatever danger might come her way. And then this is really a scary one. And what it says is, the Bureau of Canadian Information, the Department of Colonization and Development, Canadian Pacific Railway. So this is really the reality. And this ad campaign went from the 1880s, probably already all up to the 1950s. And what is really important here, as you'll see in a minute, is the imagery. This imagery which underlines a notion, the notion of terra nullius. A notion which then underlines legal apparatus that actually dispossess people from their land. So, getting back to my text here. So that's Canadian Pacific. So what's interesting with the Canadian Pacific is that that is one way that we sort of, this image of terra nullius, and again, I'm going to just make it really clear. Terra nullius is a way that is still used legally to claim people's land. But that's not enough. You need imagery of terra nullius. You need a whole apparatus that really reinforces that that land is empty. And it also comes with our most famous group of painters. They are called the Group of Seven. Okay. So you'll notice that in this, I'll go to images again. Unfortunately, downloading the images, all these images is, okay, so that is the Group of Seven. So the Group of Seven, if you'll notice, they're very similar to the ads you just saw. And what's interesting about them is it reinforces again the notion of empty space, of terra nullius. This is the most famous group of painters in Canadian history. And I'll show you a very ominous picture of them. Here they are. Good old boys.
If you go to one of these pictures, you can always click that.
Okay, cool.
Each single picture.
So you can see how they are. They're a very ominous group of men. But the point is, beyond them, is this notion of empty space and empty land. Now, again, because I'm coming from an art historian, anthropology, visual anthropology point of view and training, what is interesting is how this group somehow became painters like this, because in fact, the people, one of the most biggest influences of them was actually an African-American painter who came to Canada. And this is what it looked like before they changed it into this very ideological empty space. Okay. So this is Robert Duncanson. So I think we can see the difference there, right? This was landscape painting. And this is one of the influences of landscape painting, that somehow with a group of 7, I guess the indigenous people somehow disappeared from the paintings. And any kind of notion of life. And I wish we could see this bigger, but not only are the indigenous people shown there, but there's a very interesting engagement and irony in the photo. This painter, who's African American, he moved to Canada and he was painting in 1865. Somehow he becomes the influence who influences this group, and ironically, somehow he becomes mixed race. That's a whole other story, and he wasn't a mixed race guy. So, without being cheeky, it's important for you to understand how somehow an image like this with such richness, such radiance, and so much of a looking width somehow disappears and turns into the images that you saw before. So let us move on. So this is the imagery. This is the Terra Nullius. And I'm just going to go through this again. The literal meaning of the term Terra Nullius, and let's actually put a Terra Nullius type of image on there. So the image of Terra Nullius, as you can see right here, which is like and this remains a big influence on Canadian art. That's the funny thing. This kind of imagery somehow still influences Canadian art. So the literal meaning of the term Terra Nullius is an empty land. It came to be a legal term, or rather a quasi-legal proclamation that the Romans invoked to claim land that were not theirs, giving themselves the right to claim lands not belonging to them, which are empty, and are also giving themselves the right to claim lands that were inhabited by barbarians. And as I said before, it should be noted that this notion of Canada as a Great White North also has some provenance from the fictional imagined notion of northernness going back to the Romans. So this notion of emptiness, of creating others, is something that did not start in Canada. And it definitely starts with the notion of the Great White North. And this really is the notion of the Great White North here. So we've spoken about looking, I've shown you imagery of how looking is in a way solidified by artists who in sometimes become the ideological apparatus of the state. Not always. But then something comes later, and it's the literal legal juridical things that I've said. So the Canadian state presents itself to the world as a tolerant, anti-colonial, and self-critical state. While there are many actions Canada has taken that exemplify such a self-image, there is at least one arena in which actions strongly contradict it. And I have in mind particular the manner in which Canada explains its acquisition of sovereignty and underlying title with respect to Indigenous peoples. Here, Canada relies on legal doctrines and political tenets that follow from colonialist conceptions. Specifically, Canada assumes that its acquisition of sovereignty and underlying title with respect to Indigenous peoples is unproblematic. While treaties were negotiated, it is presumed that acquisition was always the result of a willing cession on the part of the First Nations. And this is not the truth. So we've gone over Terra Nullius, and we've gone over this notion of how it is framed. Now, one of the reasons I'm speaking today is that I have come up with this notion, which I call the 3 repertoires. And for me, the 3 repertoires are really a way to frame at least what I believe is Canadian life. And the first way that I see this is in this notion of Terra Nullius. Hang on, get back to the keynote. So this notion of the Great White North, we understand what that is. The Great White North is an enduring Canadian myth. It weaves history, geography, aesthetics, science, and even comedy into a national imaginary that invokes a metaphor of nature's purity, reinforces norms of racial purity. The double meaning of white parallels a double movement in our social and cultural history, both to assert the dominance of whiteness as a cultural norm and build a sense of national identity linked closely to nature and wildness. Non-whites and indigenous peoples are being excluded from the norm to one degree or another since the nation's inception. Again, the CP, and they're almost being on par with Coca-Cola in terms of the amount of advertising they did. The Group of Seven, painters as image makers of Canadian imaginary. Terra Nullius as a dispositivo of Canadian imaginary. Terra Nullius as a legal juridical framework. Now, the notion of an apparatus and of this dispositivo is that there are a whole set of different parts to the machine that completely form the imaginary of a country. So now I move on from the image making and I get into what is called the production of knowledge in universities. So the first thing to know is that in Canada, we have pretty much a situation of heteronormative whiteness in our universities. And this actually came to court a few years ago when 8 women initiated a complaint with the Canadian Human Rights Commission to address inequalities with the Canada research programs, having referred to it as being an old boys network. And it's funny, I think back to the pictures of the Group of Seven, and unfortunately this is the reality. What one woman said is, research stars who are predominantly men are singled out for research chairs and giving teaching reductions as much as 200%. Their colleagues have to take up the slack by teaching more. The Secretariat outlines no standard procedures for universities to identify candidates for consideration. By permitting institutions to bypass open competition for chair positions, the CRC Secretariat facilitates traditional university preferences for white, able-bodied male candidates. So again, that is the Terra Nullius. That is another part of it. But I guess one of the main reasons I'm here today is to talk about how Terra Nullius is transferred into the cultural institutions of Canada, because that's really what we need to speak about. So already I've shown you how it has been propagated, how it has been created, how it continues to be produced through painting, through the production of knowledge, and who teaches at universities, who is allowed to be a researcher at universities. But the next thing is the notion of how it produces itself in Canadian institutions. So, along with Terra Nullius is the notion of ambiguity and a notion of tautology. These are big words. Well, tautology is a big word, but I'll explain it because it's not a big thing, because it's pretty much what's keeping people controlled all the time. So, the notion of tautology is basically, if somebody says to you, if you ask somebody why they have all the power, they would just answer, because I have all the power. And again, that's a form of ambiguity. So Terra Nullius also produces itself in the cultural realm in Canada. I'm going to open actually a different PowerPoint now. So this is a PowerPoint that I did, presentation that I did in Canada almost exactly 1 year ago, actually, to this day. Let's see here. Okay, so you guys are seeing it, right? So this is an article that came out last year, and as you can read, it's called "A Crisis of Whiteness in Canada's Art Museums." So I work in the museum industry, and I work in Montreal. At this time, we're at 96% white curators, white board of directors. 1 year ago, on March 31st, the day before my birthday, I gave a talk. I gave this talk, right? On April 7th, so on March 31st, 2021, I gave the same talk. On April 7, 2021, the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts, and for the first time in 160 years, a non-white person was made a curator. So I just want to repeat that. In the last 160 years in Montreal, in the 4 museums, there has been no non-white curators. It was on April 7th of last year that Eunice Bellador was given the title of Canadian curator at the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts. And I applaud the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts because they've really been trying to change things. But this is the reality. So let's just maybe fly through this and show you what I presented last year. So last year, there was a presentation by the 4 museums speaking about why they were so white. Nothing's changed since then. That's an example of how they're trying to be bold. And it's funny, it's kind of like that kind of a group of 7 sort of imagery also. I call these colonial children's games. This is again a PowerPoint, I'm just running through it that I did last year. Okay, and now we get to what are museums? And what really do they hold? And like, when we're talking about Terra Nullius, we're talking about real shit. We're not just talking about like land and imagery. What are these museums? What do they have inside of them? So, in 2012, the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts finally decided to return a human head to the Maori people. Last week, the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts returned a toy moko, which is a human head, to the Museum of New Zealand in Wellington. The toy moko is a tattooed and mummified Maori head. This repatriation is the latest in a series of repatriations. So I think it's important when we're thinking about these questions that we're thinking about not just symbolic violence, we're thinking about real violence. Montreal Museum of Fine Art returned mummified, and this is 2012. The name of the lecture was called The Resisting Institutional Lullabies in the Time of Cholera. I was being cheeky, but it worked because somebody got hired. So let's just see if there's anything more of interest, just fly through this. This is the Guggenheim Museum where a curator was just, she was just terrorized by the head of the museum, who was fired eventually. So basically, you know, I think you get the gist. I don't have to reinforce this more. But what I can say is they're simulated and living landscapes, and that basically in the museum world and in the culture world, we're still really in deficit of where things need to be. So the next thing really is, how do we really understand these things? How do we understand how notions of terra nullius are actually being activated and produced? So there's a lot of ways to think about this. One of the ways to think about this is the notion of whiteness. Now, this is a term that has come up in the last maybe 20 years in universities. And it's not as it seems. Because anybody can invoke whiteness. They don't have to be white to invoke whiteness. So whiteness really is a reproduction of knowledge. It's a reproduction of space. And it definitely is something that supports the notion of terra nullius, whiteness studies. So here is what Sarah Ahmed says, and Rame, I brought Sarah Ahmed up because I know you like, or I mean, I think Ramon likes her a lot. Whiteness can be described as an ongoing, unfinished history, which orientates bodies in specific directions, affecting how they take up space and what they can do. So this is not about skin color. Again, whiteness can be described as an ongoing, unfinished history, which orientates bodies in specific directions, affecting how they take up space and what they can do. In this sense, as someone who works in a multidisciplinary fashion, but rooted for the most part between geography and anthropology, we are first speaking about a bodily position in space, an orientation, that is to say, that which instigates a particular regime of habitus, of a space, of occupying space, and in the context of an orientation. We are speaking about a voice that is coupled with a bodily position, a voice which is akin to a disposition, an orientation, a manner of standing and emitting one's power's position. My architect friend is over there in the audience, and I think in architecture, we know about modernist architecture, we know about the space it took up, we know about trying to challenge those forms of taking up space. So, again, from my title at the beginning, I'm always so interested in this notion of ambiguity. Ambiguity being a way to actually hold space, a way to actually take up space, and a way to keep power. So, I will give an example of this. So, this is from a philosopher named Shireen Razak. So again, in the Canadian context, she's speaking about the ambiguity in the Canadian imaginary. She says, Canadians feel compassion across difference, appropriating the pain of others as our own. Razak understands this appropriation as a national process implicated in producing Canadianness as a deeply humanitarian and compassionate in response to the pain of racial others while obscuring our complexity. So yes, there's this, appropriating the pain of others, but there's never the assumption of a complicity. This is the kind of ambiguity that is going on in how the nation produces itself. Terra Nullius and the notion of tautology. Again, I explained it before. The notion that if you ask somebody why they're in charge, they'll say, because I'm in charge. These are real things. And in the Canadian context, this really takes place in the way that we tell stories about the Indigenous people. So, white settler tautologies are things that seem true by the nature of their repetition and their logical irrefutability under settler colonialism. So again, and I'm moving faster than I thought, and I'm happy about that. Again, we go back to this notion of looking, this notion of seeking to have a looking with, not looking at. And then you have this other side, this side of a framing, this side of all kinds of frameworks and dispositivos that are enacted through visual imagery, enacted through legal documents, enacted through the control of knowledge in universities, enacted through story. So, I think I'm actually getting near the end, which is good. But I think, right now, we need to maybe start looking at some other things. And those other things really are, what is going on in terms of a counter-narrative? Because that is the name of the exhibition right now at the Clinica. And how do we disrupt those narratives? So what I'd like to do is actually just show you some of the artists that I'm working with that are Canadian, and speak a little bit about how they are challenging the notion of terra nullius, how they are challenging notions of domination. So again, it's going to be my strange Google image thing because it's the simplest thing for me. So I'll start with this guy. So this guy is a beast, to put it lightly. This is Nep Sidhu. So Nep is a person who he's born in, let's open up one of the images. See if we can go large. So, we're not large, are we? No. Okay. Yeah, it seems like largeness is not happening. Okay, maybe, let's see what happens. Yeah, that's not happening, the largeness. Everything is blocked.
James,
Yeah?
there's also a question for you on the font, if you want to look at it.
Yeah, in a minute, yeah. So, we're stuck. Okay, so we'll start with Rajni. So Rajni Pereira is an artist of Sri Lankan descent, but grew up mainly in Canada. And again, excuse the not having large images. If you want, maybe we can look at them together later. Yeah, please help me, if you can. So in the meantime, while we're trying to figure this out, so my thing, and the reason I'm the curator in residence in Canada right now, is that I'm trying to find ways of counter-narratives. I'm trying to find ways that we can get around this blockage, right? And yeah, it doesn't go that large. So what I've done is I'm looking at what I call the new region of the world. In the new region of the world, we're no longer framed, we're no longer looking at or looking to, we're in a looking with. And how does that happen? How do we actually have these real conversations and these real ways of looking? I think people can look after if they want, because it's stuck.
Yeah, it's the internet.
But what I would say is that, maybe to sum things up in a way, what's important is to find new ways of mapping contemporary thinking, of mapping the history of art. So I've been thinking through how to do that, right? And I've been thinking through how to move away from this simplistic notion of identity and these other ways that have become very popular in terms of how we speak about art. So this is an example of what I call the cosmological. The cosmological is a space that goes beyond ideology. It's a space that goes beyond framing. It's a constellation. It's amorphous. It's not square. It's not preset. It's a way of actually making space, holding space, but not being caught in space. This is an example, and again, we can look after. Nepsidhu, I'll maybe explain what he does. He is an Indian artist but grew up mainly in Canada. Now he has really created what I call fake anthropologies. So these images are not images necessarily of something from India. He's reimagined, in a sense, what future ancestors might look like. And that's an important term, the notion of future ancestors. And I'll get to that with another artist that I'm working with. So this notion of fake anthropologies, of cosmological building, of actually being able to find new ways of making worlds is one of the counter-narratives that is really important now that somebody like Nep is doing. And then his partner Rajni is another one doing that. Let's see if we can open her up. Maybe not. Okay. So we'll go to somebody else. We'll go to Joseph. This guy's very interesting, and I think La Clinica is going to grab this guy as soon as they can actually see the images up close. So Joseph Siga is an indigenous artist from Canada who's actually, as they say, unsettling exoticism. So he's really challenging this. And again, I'm sorry that we can't see up close, but we're free to. It's the internet. I don't think it's not working. Or maybe I have too much open. Okay, we're better now. Okay, so yeah, so there's do you want to stay here for a minute? Sure. So basically, as you can see, he's really playing on these images. And this is really, I'm so happy. I wrote him the other day, and he's just chill. He wrote me back, no attitude, and he is one of the most gifted new artists in our country. So as you can see with the imagery, really challenging the narratives and challenging tautologies and all the silliness that goes on. So maybe we can go back to, this is a really nice one I like, here. So, and also at the same time, playing with the notion of cosmology and redefining it. How do I get out? And another artist, I'll start speaking to her right away, is an artist named Lara Kramer. She is a performance artist and a dancer. And what's interesting about her is that she does these very slow performance pieces. And these pieces are almost ways of remapping a territory. So she will be, let's see if we can find her, hang on. Lara, maybe not. Can we open? Can we open? Yes, somewhere like that. Yeah, no internet.
No internet.
So I'll just explain anyway. So she is an artist, a performance artist. Maybe I can show you images. She is, again, so I'm talking about how do we disrupt, how do we create these narratives that go beyond the narratives that are framing. So one is the cosmological. So the cosmological you've seen before. The other one is nature, polis, culture. How do you redefine how nature and culture are defined? So that guy Joseph is really looking at the notion of perspectivism, of animacy, the animate, the relationship between plants and human beings. Another thing is the idea of thresholds. How do you cross thresholds? So this artist, Lara Kramer, she is an artist who does these performances that last an hour, and she's continuously remapping the territory that her family, in a sense, were in a sense oppressed on. Let's see if we have any other people I can show. This is an artist I'm working with that I hope to bring to Mexico. This is Ramata. She is an artist from Ivory Coast, and she is working with food and looking at how certain foods were brought to the Ivory Coast and how they were, a form of colonization. So she reframes food and reframes how it's shown, as you can see in a bit. And we are going to be doing a performative dinner in Montreal and hopefully here in Oaxaca. So she is And all of these artists, I need to make sure that you're aware of this actually, all of these artists are being ignored by the museums. These artists, Nep, who I showed you before, Nep has a solo show at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Detroit, a solo show. Rajni has had shows all over the world in biennales, and this woman has never had a show even in a proper gallery yet. So I guess maybe we can just like chill for now. Maybe I'll speak a little bit after. But let's maybe answer the question. I hope it's been kind of comprehensive. I'm sorry about the technicalities, but I think it's pretty clear what I'm saying. I think it's been pretty clear, and I think what's important is that we don't just get framed in this modernist, in this, these frames that are set for us, that we find ways and we find counter narratives so that we can look together and look with. So I think I'll end like that for now. Thank you. What's that?
Instagram handle?
Yeah. Ramata. Shiramata. I hope it was somewhat comprehensive.
There is a question for you in the cell phone.
It's in my cell phone?
It's on your cell phone.
Was Ramon able to listen to this?
Yes, I think so.
Okay, where am I finding it? On my Instagram or where?
WhatsApp.
Oh, what's that? I don't. Oh, I have to open it. Okay, so there's a question apparently. So the formula of the new region in your residency project title reminds me of the Western conception of the Americas as the new world and already known continents. How they name cities, New Hampshire, New Orleans, New York. So I'd like to ask you about the use of the word new to talk about the territory and the deterritorialization. So I actually do need to make that a little clearer. When we're talking about the new region of the world, and again, this is from my mentor. I was lucky to study with a famous philosopher named Edouard Glissant. So his book is called The New Region of the World. And what we're talking about when we're talking about the new region of the world is actually not anything new. It's a new in sort of quotation marks. What it is that we have reached a point in the history of the world where Western certitudes, where the Occident taking up all the space as being the canon in art, the canon in literature, that we all know that it no longer holds water. So the new region is actually looking at all the people that were ignored all the years. So they're not new. They were always there, right? Like that guy, Robert Duncanson, that I showed you, or even like this guy. I hope we can open this one, actually. This guy who is from Peru. Let's see here. So yeah, so that's essentially the answer. These are people that were, I'd love to show this image actually. Yeah, but it's not clear enough, I don't think. But this is an indigenous artist named Diego Quispotito. Maybe later we can look at this together properly. Have you ever seen this guy? This guy's an indigenous artist, and you want to know what year this is? This is like 1540 or something. So that's the new region of the world. Because, I mean, I think they got here in 1490, right? So this guy's like 1540, and this is on par with Bosch and some of the greatest works in the history of art. So that's the new region. In a way, we're being cheeky when we say the new region, right? And what's important about this is really uncovering the fact that those certitudes were never real. So I don't know if that answers, yeah. Any other questions at this time? I'd really love for us to see this clearly, because this guy is really, this is one of the greatest works of art, I think, in history. Obviously, it's in a church. But this is really a great example of what we've looked over, and really incredible looking wits, and powerful notions of radiance, and powerful notions of that go beyond a preset, because he's really, I mean, this is a really radical painting.
Is he a Peruvian who trained in Spain and then returned?
I think he trained in Peru. Yeah.
He's Peruvian.
He would have been like, because I know there was a school created as soon as they got there in Peru. So he would have been one of the first students. Any other questions or discussion, dialogue? Yes.
I'm not sure if you said this before.
Can you come up because I can't hear you?
Okay.
Thanks.
I wanna
I'm
give
not
her
sure
my
if you
seat.
mentioned this before. I came in, but
Come. I know you. You don't have to be scared.
you mentioned about.
Here, speak. Hey, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good.
You mentioned about how ambiguity can be about holding space.
Yeah.
Can you expand on that? Oh, you can. He mentioned how ambiguity can be about holding space, and I was wondering if you could expand on that.
Yeah. So I think it's important when I talk about ambiguity, I'm talking about an ambiguity which is constructed. You know what I mean? And that kind of ambiguity is, I mean, it's notoriously famous in governments. You know what I mean? It's an ambiguity where you're given information, but you're not really given information. It's as simple as that. You know, these are like, I think the CIA call it psyops. You know what I mean? It's an operation. It's an operation of knowledge, where you're continuously creating this obfuscation, continuously creating a narrative which is not that clear, but it's just clear enough for people to maybe buy it for a little bit of time, right? And I use the example of Canada, but obviously this is not limited to Canada, right? This is a way of holding power, at least in what I've seen, right? And I see it in my Prime Minister, right? And a great way is every time he speaks, he talks about how he loves the indigenous people while he's wearing blackface. You know what I'm saying? In the past, he's wearing blackface, right? So there's this ambiguity always in Canada that somehow we're doing something for the indigenous communities. And there's sort of like some ambiguous things that are said, and it somehow continues to keep the population satiated for a little bit of time, you know? And it's related to this notion of tautology again, because at the end of the day, people say, you know what? We shouldn't have to answer you because, you know, we're in charge. Does that answer a bit?
Yeah.
Or
So do you believe more that it's important to then choose a side, to have polarization, to decide that it is one way or another way, and not to lean into the space of ambiguity, to be clear?
I think what's interesting with that question is that, you know, certainly one of the dangers when you're creating a counter-narrative and creating other spaces is to create that same sort of space that's absolute. And that's dangerous. And again, answering that question about the new region of the world, if we really look at some of the artists from the past and the present, you'll notice that they operate more around constellation rather than something solid. So to answer you, I think the way forward is really for us to create, or not just us, but it's the really construction of amorphous forms, forms that don't follow a square, neurodiversity. These to me are really in recognizing neurodiversity. Ambiguity, the ambiguity I'm talking about ambiguity that's really invoked in forms of power, right? But there's definitely ambiguity in poetry, ambiguity in music. That's a different story, right? Those are, you know, those are forms that really don't operate under ideology. The ambiguity that I'm speaking about is an ideological ambiguity. But then there's the vague, or what Lisson calls the opaque. And that opaqueness is a beautiful way to create our own world, right? Because that opaqueness is not based on ideology, it's based on building world as constellation, not building world as spaces that are enclosed. Am I answering a little bit, or you have another?
Yeah, well, so that to me opens up this other question of how do you create then safety, a sense of safety and security for those following in this ideological new space, this space of ambiguity, this opaqueness. Because inherently, it seems, we gravitate toward looking for security and safety. We want structure. I say we because sometimes I'm included in that, as much as I like to play in the space of ambiguity in my own art. When I come out into the world, I want to see, you know, I know there's a restaurant I'm going to go to, that's the one I like, that's the food I like, I'm going to enjoy my meal.
Yeah. One of the things that's interesting, I'm actually doing a master's in urban studies now, and my subject is actually what's called fort spaces. So a fort space is a space that has no designation. So the way I would answer this actually is, I think, and let's talk in terms of creating a physical space, right? I think when you can open spaces up, like maybe even like La Clinica, or actually in France, there's a space where anybody's allowed to go any time of the day, and they can do rehearsals. You don't have to book it. You can sit down and eat. It's an old mausoleum, right? So I think this opening up, this like creating, when you're creating counter narratives, you have to create counter narratives that have an openness to them, right? You have to create counter narratives that are, you're not necessarily trying to attract people, right? You're not trying to like proselytize or to sell something to people. You're really speaking with them and hoping that they will speak with you. I don't know if I'm being vague in a way, but I can think about this group in Montreal called Moonshine. They're a group of electronic musicians from the Congo, and they created these parties because there was no spaces for black bodies in Montreal to go out late and to really feel free in the electronic scene. And they created these spaces in abandoned warehouses. And I found that interesting because going in these warehouses, there was none of the normal architecture that would hold you in. That's why I like Clinica and working in spaces like this. So when Moonshine was inviting us to the parties, you would go into a space, and each time it would be a space that is unfamiliar to you. Because there may not be walls here, there may not be a ceiling. And these amorphous spaces turned into spaces that people could feel comfortable in. And what's amazing about the Moonshine Collective and the Moonshine scene is that it became a space not just for the black population, but for the whole queer population in Montreal. Because you were going into a space that was not something that felt like a club or an apartment or something else. Every time we went to a party, it would be literally in something that was unfamiliar and that we could become familiar with, something that could become part of our bodies. You know, I like to, when I talk about cosmology, I talk about the notion of building a craft around our bodies. You know, excuse the outfit, but you know, really, I wish I could show some artists, but if people really want to know what I'm talking about, there's a really great artist from Brazil called Bispo do Rosario, and he was a mentally ill black sailor in the 1940s. Well, he was a sailor, then he came back, he was mentally ill, he had schizophrenia, they put him in a mental asylum, and he had this vision that he had to create 2,000 pieces of art, right? And all the art he made were almost like pieces that, almost like ships, things that could carry him. Even the clothing he made were like crafts. So I think when you're building spaces, you're not necessarily, I think when you're really building spaces with openness, you're not necessarily trying to get people, right? You're hoping that people will identify with something that you're offering, but you're also hoping that they will bring something to the space. And with the Moonshine Collective, they've done that, right? They've really been able to provide us with something, again, I use the word amorphous, something that we don't know. And every time we go there, we feel this great comfort.
I like a lot of what you shared because it feels very much like a lot of the answers that I'm even seeking are really still in art.
Yeah.
In forms of art, different forms of art,
Yeah.
and not necessarily in major political structures. In some ways, art needs to insert itself into politics more, maybe. That's what I'm coming to, anyway, in this.
Well, to be very honest with you, I think, you know, what's important, especially with like Clinica and with the Fonderie, Darling, where I'm curator in residence, is that art is a separate space. Do you know what I mean? Art doesn't have to be political. And I think as soon as art becomes political and says it's political, I think there can be a danger, right? I think what it needs to do is it has to circumscribe another way of thinking. And it needs to give space for people to have that thinking. That's why I like performance art. That's why I like dance. Because there's no dialogue. It's often really obscure, but what happens is that you go there and you get to create your own story. Not to sound cliche, but you get to create your own story. So when we're talking about art as a way of building worlds, that art for me really has to be, first of all, an art which does not tell me what it wants to, it doesn't tell me what I have to see. It leaves an open space for me. And one of the most important things, and this is part of my thesis in urban studies, is the notion of atmospheres. This is very important. For most of the 20th century, or from the 18th, 19th century, the history of engaging with art was on what's called the notion of aesthetic judgment. So you go up to painting and you're expected to understand the history of art and and how does that look compared to like the last painter like Gauguin or that, this and that. Right now, and it's super exciting, we have made the complete shift into what is called atmospheres. And this is a field of study now, actually. Atmospheres are the engagement in art where you have an effective relationship with what you're seeing. You have something beyond emotional engagement with it. And to me, that's the kind of spaces that are really going to be able to propel new forms of thinking, maybe even new ways of building cities in a way, you know what I'm saying? I'm hoping at some point that artists can become urban planners, I think this is urban planning in its real sense, you know what I'm saying? So I think when we're looking to art as a place to give us social, political thinking, let's be careful. Let's remember that what really needs to be engaged with is that we have an experience that allows us to build our own form of political and our own form of the social, which should really come from our bodies and not from our minds.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anybody else? I think I'm going to drink mezcal.
I have, please state who you are and where you're from. No. My name is Michael. I live in Montreal, but I was born in London, so I've seen both sides of the westernized institutions that are meant to control, deviate. Anyway, my question was, do you think institutions like the RCMP that have sort of like colonial background that I think will not change, do you think those kind of institutions will ever change? Because they keep changing forms, but the core idea behind like the RCMP, for example, is still the same from inception. Do you also have examples of other institutions that you can think of that are part of this great narrative to paint a picture that is not what it is?
Again, don't quote me, I'll probably be in politics at some point in my life. And actually, I'm involved in a political party in some way. But I really shy away from even really dealing with any kind of state apparatus, because one of the things that Rame knows well, I'm not talking Rame, but anybody who's educated in a real serious way on nation, is the state is inherently violent. You can't be a state and not be violent. So when you're talking about an institution like RCMP or something, it's not even part of my dialogue, or it's not even part of my thing. Again, I would go back to the Moonshine Collective. These kids who were created, they've gone from doing the parties to actually creating a brand and actually creating a movement around the world where they actually have some social capital and they become to something important. The notion of social capital, because if we're really, really, really thinking about what art can do, what we can do to art, what we can do, it's really about these spaces becoming spaces for social capital. And if people are not familiar with social capital, it's as simple as tonight, maybe some people will talk after this and say, hey, I have a friend at this place who's doing this and doing that. That kind of capital is really as valuable as the other state capital. And I think that's a way of doing it. I mean, look at Fela Kuti, right? He created his own social capital. He created his own republic in Nigeria. And even till today, Fela Kuti's separate nation within Nigeria is still activating people's imagination. Like myself, I wouldn't be here without Fela Kuti. So I think it's important for us to realize the value of social capital and how it comes from engaging with alternative art institutions, engaging with alternative forms of thinking, engaging with understanding that how valuable it is to really engage with these casual conversations we have like these, and to bring them, see where we go. My friend Tayo is here, and what she's, I mean, like, I wouldn't be here without Tayo. She introduced me to Ramen. She understands social capitalism. She understands how important it was for me to meet Ramen. And it came from Tayo taking the initiative. I didn't ask her to introduce me to Ramen. Taking the initiative to understand that sharing of her social capital of knowing Ramen would bring us to this, would bring us to a possible continual collaboration. So I think that's important. Do not underestimate social capital. I mean, certainly people like Kanye West have not.
Just wanna, quiero agradecer muchísimo a todos ustedes, a James, Tayo, for making this beautiful connection at this moment. This space is very much about engagement. It's about opening and creating new vocabularies, as James was addressing during his conversation. And I'm pleased that you're here. Thank you so much for being here. And first of all, aplausos por favor para James. Muchísimas gracias.
Thanks for staying. Please have a mezcal with me because I wasn't planning to drink.
Please have a mezcal with me. I wasn't planning to drink. I don't want to drink alone. Let's go.